The gate was empty. Everyone else had taken the airline's hotel vouchers and left. Daniela Rodriguez was the only other person still there, my work rival for the better part of 2 years, sitting on a plastic chair with her shoes off and her laptop open, and her face doing the thing it does when she's trying very hard to look fine. She looked up. I looked at her. Neither of us said anything for a moment, just the particular silence of two people who have spent 18 months in each other's professional orbit and have never, before this moment, been the only two people in a room. Then she said, "You stayed. You stayed," I said. She looked at the departure board above the gate, where our flight time had been replaced with the word "canceled," and then replaced again with a 6 a.m. time that felt like a different relationship to the word "tomorrow" than the one we'd had an hour ago. "The rebooked flight is at 6, she said. "Hotel's probably not worth it for 6 hours, I said. She looked at her laptop. That's what I told myself. We both knew we were not telling ourselves the whole truth. A hotel voucher is worth a 6 a.m. flight, and we'd both been standing at the voucher desk an hour earlier and both walked away from it. We'd both decided to stay for a reason that neither of us was going to name at 11 o'clock on a Friday night, with the storm throwing rain sideways against the terminal windows and the gate empty of everyone but us. I sat down. Not next to her, 2 seats over, which is the internationally acknowledged distance between people who know each other professionally and are maintaining the professional version of things. She went back to her laptop. I went back to mine. We worked in the same silence for about 20 minutes, the parallel silence of two people who have been occupying adjacent territory for a year and a half and have learned to exist in each other's periphery without looking directly at each other. It was a comfortable silence in the specific way that silences are comfortable when everyone in them already knows the rules. Then her laptop died. Then her laptop died. We had met, in the professional sense, 18 months ago, at the company that employed us both. She was brought in to lead a strategic development function that sat adjacent to mine, and the adjacency was, from the beginning, the structural problem. We competed for the same projects, the same client visibility, the same attention from the same senior leadership, using skill sets that overlapped enough to make direct comparison inevitable, and that differed enough to make genuine collaboration complicated. I want to be honest about how I'd thought about her, because the honesty is necessary for what came later. I had thought about Daniela Rodriguez the way you think about a genuinely formidable competitor, with respect that lived right next to wariness, with the particular quality of attention you pay to someone whose moves you need to anticipate before they make them. I knew her professional reputation thoroughly and had maintained, as a deliberate professional choice, a precise distance from her as a person. The two things were separate: the competitor I needed to track, the person I didn't need to know. Her professional reputation was not difficult to parse. She was strategic, decisive, technically excellent, and had the rarest kind of analytical intelligence. She could simplify complex problems in ways that made the solutions look obvious in retrospect, which is the gift that is most infuriating to compete against, because you can't identify it as luck, and you can't dismiss it as style. In meetings, we were cordially adversarial in the way that people who are competing for the same recognition are when they're both too professional to be openly hostile about it. We'd each push back on the other's frameworks when it was strategically useful to do so, occasionally agree in ways that felt more tactical than genuine, and then watch from the periphery as the room made its decisions. I had spent 18 months tracking her the way you track the thing that sets your standard, closely enough to know exactly where the competition was, not closely enough to forget that competition was the operating mode. She was also, in the office, contained in a specific way. Not cold, she was engaged and responsive and clearly good in rooms, but there was a visible boundary between what she brought professionally and everything else about her. The personal was absent, or at least invisible. She kept a clear distance between what she was at work and whatever she was everywhere else, which I had always read as a deliberate professional choice, and a strategically sound one, in an environment where showing too much personal texture gives the competition information they didn't ask for. I had built my own version of the same distance. We were, in the office, professionally courteous in the way that two people who genuinely respect each other's capabilities and are also fighting for the same resources tend to be, not hostile, not warm, just precisely calibrated at the point of mutual regard and mutual wariness. The calibration was useful. It had kept things clean for 18 months. Her laptop dying broke the calibration. She didn't say anything when it went dark. She closed it, looked at it for a moment, put it in her bag with the particular economy of someone containing their frustration, and sat back. And then she was just sitting there, in gate 37, with her shoes off and her laptop dead and nothing left to do with her hands, and the storm was still going outside the windows, and the only thing to look at that wasn't the windows was me. I said, "I have a portable charger." She looked at me. "If you want it," I said. A pause. "Thank you," she said. I handed it over. She plugged in the laptop and we were back to parallel silence, except that the charger was now a small fact between us, something I had that she needed. A transaction of the uncompetitive kind. It changed the register slightly, the way a small concession changes the register of any negotiation, by making it no longer entirely a negotiation. We worked in the new version of the silence for another hour, 40 minutes. The rain against the windows, the gate's overhead lights at their night mode half-brightness. The particular quality of being in a public space after the public has left, which is never quite either public or private. Around midnight she made a sound. Not a word. An exhale with something in it. The kind that escapes when the performance is costing more than you have available to spend on it. She set the laptop on the seat beside her and turned slightly and looked at the storm through the windows. And then she said, to approximately no one, "I hate this." "The delay?" I said. "All of it." She gestured at the terminal. "The whole configuration." "Which configuration?" She turned and looked at me. Not the office look, the other one, the one where someone has gotten too tired to maintain the version of themselves that they normally show. The one where I have been excellent at my job for 18 months and I'm sitting in an airport at midnight on the Friday of a conference trip with my shoes off because I'm too exhausted to pretend that I'm not exhausted. She turned back to the windows. That configuration. I didn't say anything for a moment. The statement had landed differently than anything either of us had said to each other in 18 months of working in the same building. Then I said, "I know which meeting I first really understood that." She looked at me. "The Kirwan pitch," I said. "About 14 months ago, you restructured the whole strategic approach in real time when the client pushed back on the first angle. Not a surface adjustment. A fundamental reorientation that preserved the logic while changing the frame. The room turned in about 40 seconds. I paused. "I left that meeting thinking you were going to be difficult to compete with." She studied me for a moment. Something in her face shifted. Not dramatically. Just a small relaxation in the thing she'd been maintaining. "You were in the Kirwan meeting," she said. "I was in the Kirwan meeting. I didn't know you were there." "I sat in the back," I said. "I was supposed to be presenting the following week, and I was watching how you handled the format." She looked at the windows. "The Hendricks proposal," she said. "About a month after that. Yours. You read the Hendricks proposal." "I read everything you produce," she said. "We all read each other's work. That's the environment." She paused. "I read the Hendricks proposal, and I thought you had a way of framing risk that I hadn't seen structured that way before, and it was going to be difficult to present anything to that client afterward without the comparison being made." "I read everything you produced too," I said. We looked at each other. Two people who had spent 18 months paying very close, very careful attention to each other and performing at the outer edge of their ability for an audience that included the other person and had somehow not mentioned it. "Okay," she said. "Okay," I said. She looked at the laptop, set it back on her bag, looked at me. "Are you hungry?" There is a specific kind of conversation that only happens in airports after midnight. The ordinary context is gone. You're not at work, not at home, not anywhere that has its usual structures. The temporal disorientation of travel at the wrong hour strips something away. The managed version, the professional version, the performance of being the person you need to be in the room you're usually in. And the stripping is what makes certain conversations possible. We ate terrible airport food from the one kiosk still open, a pre-packaged sandwich situation she evaluated with the expression of someone identifying a poor investment. And we talked. Not about work, about everything around work, about what we'd each wanted before this job and the version of ourselves we'd expected to be at this point in our careers. She'd wanted to design buildings. architecture school 2 years in, and the economics of it hadn't worked the way she'd needed them to, and strategy had been the adjacent thing that let her use the same part of her brain in a context that paid: the spatial thinking, the three-dimensional problem, the solution that has to live in the same number of dimensions as the problem itself. Strategy is just architecture for systems, she said. I'm going to steal that. Please do, she said. It's the most useful framework I have for explaining why most strategy decks are frustrating. They solve on one plane when the problem lives in three. I thought about the Kerwin pitch, the real-time reorientation, three-dimensional thinking, exactly. She asked what I'd wanted. I told her the version I don't usually tell, not the professional narrative I've refined over years into something smooth and intentional sounding, but the actual one. That I'd wanted to teach, early on, in the genuine sense of it. I had wanted to be in rooms where I was handing things to people who didn't have them yet. Which is a different motivation than the rooms I'd ended up in, which were mostly rooms where everyone already had something and the contest was about who had more of it. I'd ended up here through a series of lateral moves that each made sense at the time and that had collectively produced a career I was genuinely good at and had mixed feelings about that I had not said out loud to anyone. She listened with her full attention in the specific way she apparently brought to everything. She asked one follow-up question. The exact right one. The kind that requires you to be more honest than you'd planned to be. And I answered it honestly because it was midnight, and the airport and the concourse was empty, and there was no performance left to maintain. You're thinking about the next thing, she said. I'm thinking about the next thing, I said. What does it look like? I don't know yet. I know what it feels like. That's different. She looked at her cup. That's actually the harder information to have, she said. Knowing what something feels like without knowing what it looks like yet. Because then you have to build toward a feeling, which is less specific than building toward a plan, and requires more faith in the feeling's accuracy. Is that what you did with architecture? She paused. That's what I did with architecture, she said. And it's what I'm doing now, which is part of why the configuration I described earlier is frustrating. I know what it should feel like when it's working. I don't always know if it currently looks like what it should feel like. She looked at the storm outside, which is either the most honest thing I've said to anyone in a year or the most alarming. Both. Probably, I said. Probably, she agreed. She was funny, once the office version had been set aside, dry and quick, and willing to be sharp about things she cared about. She talked about her family with affection and the specific comedic precision of someone who has spent years finding the right language for something both genuinely hard and genuinely important, and who has arrived at a version of that language that makes the difficulty survivable and the importance visible simultaneously. She talked about the city she'd lived in before this one, the particular quality of the light there in the late afternoon, the way she'd arranged her apartment when she'd had the time to arrange it properly, and the way she'd let it drift since. Small things. The kind of small things you tell someone when you've decided you're telling them something real. At some point I told her something I hadn't told anyone. Nothing dramatic, just a thing I'd been sitting with that I hadn't had a place to put, and the airport at midnight was apparently the place for things that hadn't found their place yet. She didn't make it larger than it was or smaller than it was. She just received it and said something back that showed she'd understood what kind of thing it was. That's rarer than it should be. I noted it. By 11:30 we were talking about things with no professional utility whatsoever. By 12, when she stopped mid-sentence and said, "You're still here," I understood what she meant, which was not about the airport. "We're both still here," I said. "I mean, I didn't think I'd have this conversation tonight," she said. "With you. Of all people." She looked at me directly. "You're my competitor." "I know," I said. "I've been excellent, and so have you, and we've been fighting over the same square footage for a year and a half." She said it without heat, just as the fact it was. "And I'm sitting in an airport at midnight telling you about the light in Philadelphia and the architecture school." "You can tell me to stop," I said. "I'll go back to my laptop." She looked at her hands. "I don't want you to stop," she said. "Then we're here," I said. She leaned back in the plastic chair. Her eyes went to half-mast, the way eyes go when the body has decided to take the sleep it's owed. Her head tilted slightly to the left, and at 12:17 in the morning, she tipped sideways, and her shoulder came to rest against mine, and she was asleep in about 90 seconds. I sat with this, with the specific quality of it, My work rival of 18 months. The person whose Kerwin pitch I'd studied, and whose Hendricks response I'd spent weeks thinking about, asleep on my shoulder at gate 37 in the middle of a storm. I thought about the shoes-off version of her and the full-attention listening version and the I don't want you to stop version, and I thought about how those three things fit with the professional version I'd been tracking for 18 months. They fit. That was the thing. They were the same person. I just hadn't been in a position to see it before. I didn't move. She was awake at 2 a.m. She straightened up, looked at me, looked at the gate, said, "Oh," with a specific quality of mortification. And I said, "You needed the sleep." And she said, "I've been awake since 5 a.m. yesterday." And I said, "I know, me too." And there was a moment where we both understood that the mortification wasn't necessary, that whatever had changed in the past 4 hours wasn't going to be undone by the shoulder lean. She went to the kiosk and came back with 2 coffees. She handed me one without asking what kind, which is what you do for someone when you've graduated past needing to ask, and she sat down in the adjacent seat rather than the 2-away seat, which was also a thing that had changed. We sat with the coffees, and she was quieter than she'd been before the sleep, more still, more direct. The particular quality of a person who has passed the point of managing their energy and is spending only what's essential. The hour and the shoulder and the sleep had cleared something rather than complicated it. She was operating on less reserve and more honesty. She turned the cup in both hands in the way I'd been watching her do it all evening. "There's a project presentation Monday," she said. "Meridian," I said. She looked at me. "You know about Meridian." "I've been tracking it," I said. "It's been visible from adjacent territory." She nodded slowly. "Raymond Chen is presenting Monday as the strategic lead." She said it the way she said most things that were difficult. Directly, without decoration, as established fact. He's been positioning himself with leadership as the architect of the Meridian strategy. The emails, the briefings with the project lead, the informal conversations. It's been a month-long construction project. The narrative is that he led the strategic development as the key driver of the framework. I said, and I developed the Meridian framework, she said. The strategic structure, the 3-axis approach, the market segmentation logic, the risk-weighting methodology. I had the foundational documents completed in February. I'd been developing the approach for the 3 months before that. She looked at the window. Raymond joined the project 5 weeks ago. He contributed the execution planning, which was good work, genuinely, and he has been systematically presenting himself as the person who built the thing ever since. He's been credit claiming, I said. He's been credit claiming, she said, and he has a 2-year relationship with the project lead that I don't have. On Monday, when the decision is made about who runs the Meridian initiative, it's going to be based on the story Raymond has spent a month telling. She set the cup down. I have the documentation, the original files with timestamps, the email chain showing the development arc. What I don't have is anyone who can speak to the timeline from the room. I was very still for a moment. I was in the February meeting, I said. She looked at me. The meeting where you first presented the framework, I said. I was there. I was in it because I had been developing a parallel approach to the same problem, and I attended to see how the initial reception looked before I brought my version forward. Your framework made mine redundant within the first 20 minutes. I paused. Raymond wasn't in that meeting. He wasn't on the project in February. I know the timeline because I was watching it happen in real time. End quote. The gate was very quiet. You remember the February meeting, she said. I read everything you produce, I said. And I was in the rooms where it was produced. I told you. She looked at me for a long moment. The direct look, the airport look, the one without the professional management layer. Why would you say anything, she said. On Monday, you don't have to. We're competitors. I was in the meeting, I said. I know what happened. That's not an answer to why you would say anything. I looked at her, at the cup she was still holding with both hands, turning slightly. At the shoes that were still off, on the floor beside the plastic chair, because it was 2 in the morning and she'd stopped pretending she wasn't tired, and she'd told me about the architecture school, and she'd leaned on my shoulder for an hour and 45 minutes, and all of that had happened, and I was not going to walk out of this airport and back into the professional version of things and pretend it hadn't. Because I was here, I said, tonight, and I can't be here and not say anything. She held the cup. She looked at the windows. Monday, she said. Monday, I said. The 6 a.m. flight boarded at 5:45 and was crowded in the specific way of early morning travel. Quiet, stripped of affect, everyone managing the same accumulated exhaustion without acknowledging it. We sat 2 rows apart by ticket assignment. She was in front of me and to the left, and I could see a corner of her jacket from where I was sitting. The same jacket she'd been wearing when she sat down at gate 37 with her shoes off at 11 o'clock. I spent the flight thinking about the February meeting and what I was going to do about it. The honest account of that thinking, there was a version of me that wouldn't have done anything. That version would have stayed in his lane, treated Monday as her problem to navigate, moved on and gone back to the professional version of things. The competitor tracking the competitor, the precisely calibrated distance, the parallel working silence. That version wasn't wrong exactly. He just would have made his decision before gate 37, before the dead laptop and the shoes-off configuration and the architecture school and the shoulder and the 2 a.m. coffee handed over, without asking what kind. That version of me would have had less information. He would have known her only professionally, which is knowing one plane of a three-dimensional thing. I had more information now. And more information changes the decision if you're willing to let it change the decision rather than finding ways to work around it. At the conference Saturday, we worked the same rooms from different angles, the way we always had. But the dynamic had shifted and both of us knew it, and neither of us commented on it, which was itself a kind of communication. She introduced me to someone she knew in the context of a panel discussion we both attended. I introduced her to someone I knew during a reception. These are small things. In the prior version of our professional relationship, they wouldn't have happened. We'd have worked the same room from separate angles, as competing rather than complementary. At dinner, she sat across from me rather than at the other end of the table, and we talked across it the way people talk when they've been honest with each other at midnight in an empty airport, and the professional performance is no longer the only version available. Neither of us mentioned Monday. We both knew I was going to be in that room. Sunday evening, flying home, she sent me an email. No message, just the documentation attached. The original Meridian strategic documents with timestamps. The email chain showing 3 months of development before Raymond arrived. Her February communication to the project lead describing what she was building. Everything I would need, laid out. I wrote back, "I'll be there Monday." She replied, "You don't have to." I replied, "I know." The strategy meeting was at 10 a.m. I arrived at 9:50 and took a seat closer to the center of the table than I normally sit, which is a small positioning choice that everyone in that kind of room understands as a signal about intent. Raymond was already there, his deck open, the energy of someone who has spent the weekend building toward a moment. He presented well. He always presents well. The deck was polished, the narrative was coherent and confident, and the strategic framework was hers, reorganized in his idiom, attributed to a collaborative process with himself as the key driver. Every slide carried his framing. He referenced the team's analytical work without specifying who had done it. He talked about bringing the pieces together in a way that positioned him as the architect of a structure he'd moved into after the foundation was laid. I'd seen this before. Not from him specifically, just the pattern of it, the specific way someone takes the work of another person and presents it at a resolution where the origin is blurry. It requires a kind of practiced fluency that is itself a form of skill, which is part of why it works. I let him finish the first section. Then I said, "I want to offer some context on the development timeline." Raymond looked at me across the table with the expression of someone who has not anticipated this specific variable. "I was in the meeting in February where this framework was first presented," I said. "The strategic structure, the three-axis approach, the market segmentation methodology, the risk-weighting logic, was developed by Daniela Rodriguez and presented to a project subset in February. I attended that meeting." Raymond wasn't on the project at that point. He joined approximately 5 weeks later, end quote. I looked at the project lead directly. I think it would be useful to hear from Daniela on the development arc before we finalize the project lead assignment. The timeline matters for understanding how the work was built. The room was quiet in the specific way that follows a statement that everyone is going to remember, not because it was loud or dramatic, but because it was specific and factual and had the quality of something that changes the shape of what comes next. Raymond began to say something. "I have the documentation," Daniela said, calmly. She put it on the table, the printed email chain, the time-stamped original strategy files, her February communication to the project lead. I'd like 20 minutes to walk through the strategic logic as it was developed, starting from the initial framework. She looked at the project lead starting from February. She got the 20 minutes. The project lead role wasn't assigned Monday. It was put on hold while the project history was reviewed. The standard response when documentation surfaces that doesn't align with the narrative that's been building. Raymond's contribution wasn't disputed. He'd done genuine work on the execution planning, and no one was claiming otherwise. What changed was the frame around that contribution. The Meridian Initiative had a documented strategic architect, and her documentation was time-stamped and coherent and predated Raymond's involvement by months. He submitted a counter-narrative, which was given the consideration it deserved, and then weighed against the email chain from February, and the email chain from February is a more durable thing than a counter-narrative. She got the role, not because of me. I want to be clear about this because the clarity matters. I provided the timeline, confirmed the February meeting, and created an opening in the room. That's what I contributed. The role went to her because she had built the strategy, documented the building of it, and been in the room to explain it from the beginning when she was given the opportunity. Those were her files. That was her framework. That was her three-dimensional thinking applied to a three-dimensional problem for 3 months before Raymond walked in. I said what I knew, which was true, and which I'd been in a position to know because I had been paying the kind of attention to her work for 18 months that you pay to someone who sets the standard you're working against. That attention turned out to be useful for something other than the competition. I told her this on Wednesday, and she said, "That's either the most useful thing a competitor has ever done for me, or the most ironic." "Both, probably," I said. "Probably," she agreed. We had coffee on Wednesday. Not the elevator coffee or the kitchen coffee, an actual planned off-site coffee, scheduled the day before by text message, which was new territory, and both of us knew it was new territory, and neither of us performed as though it wasn't. She was there first. Corner table, jacket on the back of the chair, both hands around the cup, waiting. "Why did you stay?" she said. "Monday. You didn't have to." "I was in the meeting," I said. "I knew the timeline." "That's the true fact," she said. "It's not the reason." She turned the cup. "You could have not said anything. In the specific professional geometry of our situation, not saying anything would have been correct. You'd have lost nothing. It wasn't your problem." She looked at me. "Most people don't say anything. I know. So why did you?" I looked at her. At the corner table version. The one that was somewhere between the office version and the Gate 37 version. More available than the first and less exhausted than the second. The version that was emerging now that there was a context for it to emerge into. "Because I was in an airport with you for 8 hours," I said, "and I can't unknow who I found out you were." She was quiet for a moment. "The architecture school," I said. "The light in Philadelphia. The way you described what strategy should feel like when you've actually built it correctly rather than just described how it should look. The shoes off at midnight." I paused. "The shoulder." She held the cup. "That changes things," she said. "It changed things," I said. "Past tense. The change already happened." "I'm just reporting on it." She looked at me. "The direct look. The airport look. The one that first appeared when the laptop died and there was nothing left to point her attention at except what was actually in the room." "Okay," she said. "Then what now?" "Now we figure out what this is," I said. "Since it isn't only competition anymore." She turned the cup, set it down, met my eyes. "Okay," she said. "Let's figure out what this is." I've thought since then about what the airport did. Not the weather delay. The airport itself. The specific conditions of it. The late hour. The empty gate. The dead laptop. The shoes off and the nowhere to be that wasn't where you were, with the person who was also nowhere else. Airports are not comfortable places, but they are honest ones. You can't maintain a performance past a certain point when you're exhausted and stranded with no audience to maintain it for and no professional context to inhabit. The armor has a maintenance cost, and at midnight in an empty concourse that cost becomes higher than the benefit. And then it becomes impossible, and then you're just a person in an airport talking to another person in an airport. She was the person she'd always been. That's the specific thing about it. The airport just removed what had been making it easier not to see that. I've thought about what I was maintaining too. The calibration, the professional courtesy, the competitor's attention, the deliberate distance from her as a person. I'd been maintaining it for a year and a half because it was strategically useful and because I had, somewhere in the maintenance of it, decided that the competitor was all there was to know. That the professional version was the whole of the thing. It wasn't the whole of the thing. It was one dimension of a three-dimensional problem, which is exactly what she'd said about strategy, that you can't solve on one plane when the thing you're solving lives in three. She'd been right about that too. I've thought about Raymond. He knew what he was doing. He'd watched her develop the strategy, identified the gap between what she'd built and the leadership relationships she hadn't yet cultivated, and walked confidently into that gap. His miscalculation was assuming no one who'd been in the February meeting would speak up. He wasn't wrong about most people. He just hadn't factored in what a storm delay and an empty gate and 8 hours can do to someone's professional distance. Some distances don't survive contact. Some performances become impossible before they become unnecessary. Some things only become visible at midnight that would never have surfaced at noon in a conference room. And once they're visible from the airport side, the conference room side stops being the whole picture. And once they're visible, the pre-midnight version of the relationship becomes the one that doesn't fit anymore, the costume rather than the person. The gate was empty. She had her shoes off. She was trying very hard to look fine. I sat down 2 seats away, the 2-seat distance, the professional distance, and then I handed her a charger, and that was the beginning of the thing that turned out to matter. Not the competition, which we'd both been excellent at, but the thing on the other side of it that neither of us had been in a position to see until the storm put us in the same place, with nowhere to be but where we were, and nothing to do about it but talk Hern. Here's what I've been thinking about. Have you ever been stranded with someone, stuck long enough, at the wrong hour, with no performance left to maintain, and had the stuckness reveal something about them that didn't fit the category you'd put them in? Something that made you realize the category was the problem, not the person? And underneath that, is there someone in your life right now that you've been holding at a careful or professional distance? Someone you've decided you know because you know the role they occupy? And have you ever asked yourself honestly whether the distance is about them or about what it would mean to you if they turned out to be someone different from who you'd decided they were? The gate was empty. The laptop died. The shoes came off at midnight. Some distances don't survive contact. Write it in the comments. I read every single one, and I'll be there. If stories like this find you when you need them, subscribe. There's more where this came from, and more empty gates, and more shoes off at midnight.